Welcome to Transformational Blueprints, the podcast that's here to tackle the big question. Why do so many transformation programs fall short, and what can we do about it? I'm Mario Michaels, founder and director of Synaxia Group, and I'm thrilled to have you join me. In this series, we go beyond theory, bringing you first-hand stories and insights from some of the world's top architecture and transformation leaders. It's all about sharing real-world lessons, sparking fresh ideas, and giving back to the architecture community. So whether you're looking to learn, be inspired, or stay ahead of the curve, grab your coffee, settle in, and let's dive in together. There we go, right. I'll go ahead and start speaking now. So welcome everybody. Today we're going to be talking to Jon Hill on why enterprise architecture needs a reality check. For those of you who don't know Jon, he's an experienced IT leader with a career spanning more than 2 decades across pharmaceuticals and lab management. He's currently the VP of Enterprise Architecture, Data and Analytics at Alvotech, where he shapes technology strategy and drives business value through data-driven decision-making. Previously, Jon held senior leadership roles at AstraZeneca, including Head of Architecture for R&D IT, where he led global teams delivering enterprise architecture across critical business functions. More recently, he also stepped in as interim CIO at Alvotech, guiding transformation and laying foundations for lasting operational improvements with a deep expertise in enterprise strategy, data and analytics, and IT delivery. Jon has a track record of aligning technology with business growth. Jon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
So it's good to be on the other side of the video, right? Because you've got
Absolutely.
your own podcast.
Yeah, it's something we started probably about 5-6 months ago, myself and Hassan Abba, who we worked together at AstraZeneca, and I was inspired to get talking about the reality of EA and the practical way of getting about it. So I know we're going to be touching on a bit of that today as well. So
brilliant. So just for a bit of context, would you mind just giving us a background on sort of how you got to where you are now and what your remit at Alvotech is?
Yeah, sure. You were very generous a moment ago saying over 2 decades. It's nearly 3 now, I think. But yeah, so I did a computer science degree and actually went straight into a role as an implementation analyst. So I was kind of implementing laboratory information management systems, getting stuck in with coding, writing specs, documentation, training, bit of everything really. Got into project management and then spent 11 years at that company, Thermo Fisher, and left there as the head of the EMEA services team.
Okay.
I left there to move to AstraZeneca, where I joined as a program manager, but very quickly got into kind of program delivery and picked up ownership and leadership of their finance data warehouse, which I did for a good few years. That gave me a fantastic background in data and data warehousing and all those kind of things. Learned a lot about what to do and what not to do.
Yeah.
And after about 6 or 7 years there, I realized what I was doing was actually architecting the data warehouse as much as I was leading the delivery of it. And then a role came up in EA and I moved into EA and I haven't really looked back since then. Fairly quickly, fortunately, managed to get into a role of head of architecture for the enabling unit. So it was finance, HR, legal, all those kind of teams.
Okay.
Then we took on research and development into that team as well. So I had a really big remit at that point. And then we split off and I was the head of architecture for R&D. So at that point, I had about 60 solution and enterprise architects working for me. And then in 2021, it just felt like a good time. I've been there for 15 years. And then I moved to Alvotech, who are a biotech company dedicated to developing and manufacturing biosimilar medicines for people all over the globe. And I'm as you said before, I'm the VP of Enterprise Architecture, Data and Analytics, and just kind of bringing all that experience to bear, really. Although this is quite a different role because I'm a team of one in Alvotech. So I'm the enterprise architect, but also get involved doing solution architecture and even, data architecture at times too. So that's been a really interesting kind of getting back to the floor maybe a bit more, and it's been good to put some of those things back into practice in reality.
We're going to talk about the theory versus practicality in a moment as well, so you're probably in a really good position to be able to talk about that. Just before we do, we've got a question from our previous guest, Henrik Magnusson. What would make an architecture team so good that they can't be ignored, and how does the leader enable that?
So it's a brilliant question, I think. I think ultimately it's all about the demonstration of value, right? And it's a conversation that goes on over and over in enterprise architecture. And of course, the nirvana is that for everything everything you do, you've got a clear business case laid out, and you can show a tangible benefit on everything. But we know that life isn't always like that. So I think you need to make sure that the team are engaged on meaningful activities, and at the very least delivering perceived value by the business, whatever that means in your business. But then as a leader, you need to be helping to steer that team and make them so that they can't be ignored. You need to be out there singing their praises, backing them up, making sure that they're working on the right things, having those hard conversations and taking them off things that aren't value add, and being ready to back up your team, promoting what they're doing, and trying to do your best to do that good EA stuff, linking back to strategic objectives, linking back to high level business profile, activities that are going on. But yeah, and I think what I found, I think we'll touch on this later as well, but what I found in my career is if you make yourself useful and you make yourself valuable, whether that be perceived or tangible, then you will be a team that can't be ignored. People will start to come to you.
Yeah, it's how, as you say, how you go about that, isn't it? And yeah, it's a really difficult one for architects because it's not like an engineer whereby they are producing something that either goes out to the wider world or goes internally, and that something, i.e. the software, is beneficial to the business one way, shape or another. Architect role is very different from that perspective, and we're going to talk about how can we make it more practical and tangible in a moment. What do you think makes a great architect in today's world, John?
So I think a great architect is someone who can listen, adapt, and make good decisions kind of in context. So I was thinking about this and thinking one thing is you've got to be really aware of your own personal biases. Being a one-man band in Alvotech means I've got to constantly check myself and talk to other people to make sure that they're checking me and making sure I'm not just kind of in my own little bubble. So I think, you've got to listen actively and make sure you've got the context right, adapt to the way that the business is changing and the constraints that are in there, and making the best decisions based on that bigger picture. And I think I think the ability to kind of let go of the small stuff is really important, and just focus that energy on driving the overall architecture forward and getting to a better place. So, I've often used a building analogy, and I know some people don't like it, but the building analogy for an architect is, if you're a building architect, you don't walk down on site and tell the builders the depth of the mortar that's needed and exactly the bolts that they need to use to put to connect things together. You're drawing a high level blueprint. You understand how these things work, and it's going to work, but you need to be able to get in there and step back a bit, but help guide and keep people with you on the way.
Okay, fair enough. And sometimes that's where some solution architects who have come through the engineering route do end up gravitating towards that level of detail, because that's what they're used to. That's where their career taking them so far. So it's really hard to create that, not barrier, but that space between the people doing and the people architecting. So you're not stepping on each other's toes, but you're also got the time to go and add the value elsewhere.
Just to add to that, so I really learned that at AstraZeneca when we started having to deal with developers. So we had to create architectures and frameworks that developers could work in. And a lot of the solution architects were very nervous that I was saying, hey, listen, let's let the developers decide what libraries they're going to use. Let the developers decide what programming language they're going to use. We don't need to have control over that. We just need to make sure that those are solid languages, that we keep them up to date, that we're doing the right things by that. Then we can step back and they can get on, they use their tools. So I think that really became home really clear to me there.
Why do you think some architects feel paralyzed by theory, whilst others lean entirely into pragmatism?
So this is a really tricky one, right? So I think in a lot of professional roles you have a qualification, and a lot of people seek those qualifications to kind of
Hmm.
validate that they're doing the right thing. So project managers will have PMP and Prince 2, developers will go and get their language certifications or their AWS or Azure certifications. Even business analysts will learn a BPMN or UML.
Hmm.
And then there are these frameworks out there. TOGAF is the obvious one that are laid out there as the corresponding frameworks and qualifications for architects. But I think architecture's a bit different, and I don't, you can't, if you're a project, got to be careful with this. I don't think if you're a project manager and you just rock up and follow Prince 2 that you're going to be a great project manager either.
Yeah,
But it will guide you through the
yeah.
steps, and you will get an outcome that will be a
Hmm.
more controlled project than if you just rock up with a notepad and a pen.
Hmm.
I think that if you try and do that with some of the bigger frameworks out there with EA, you're just going to get in a mess very quickly. And I think the problem is what you're doing is you're saying, here's a methodology. And I try and say, go on the training if that's what you want to do, but treat it as a framework. Sorry, treat it as a toolkit, and understand the things that are in that toolkit, but you're going to have to use all those pieces
Yeah,
all over the place in different contexts. And I think sometimes that theory can feel a bit paralyzing to people, because they kind of almost imply that you need that until you've done the complete set of artifacts. Your job as an
yeah.
enterprise architecture isn't complete. I think the pragmatic architect then understands that actually success is about making things happen, joining the dots, and not just ticking every box, and making sure that things are working in context of the business that you're working in. I'm going to get really boring with that phrase, I
Hmm.
think, as we talk, but it's all about the business and not the methodology with architecture. And I can't think of many other
Disciplines,
many other
discipline.
disciplines where that's the case. Yeah.
And that's a really crucial point, and that's why I love doing architecture as from a talent perspective,
Mm.
is because you can have two enterprise architect live roles with two different businesses, and whilst the job description says exactly the same thing, the challenges and the outcomes are completely different because the businesses are different. So,
Absolutely.
how do you define the environment you're working in so you know how much theory to apply? What
So
sort of, I suppose an easy way, what sort of triggers should one, when they walk in the first sort of 90 days, everybody does a 30, 60, 90-day plan. What sort of things should they be looking out for to define, right, okay, we're probably going to need more theory here or more pragmatism or blend of both? Always a
so
blend of both, but I suppose which way?
Yeah, I think so. And there's no real simple answer to this. I think the interesting thing is you'll know when it's wrong,
Yeah.
because
It's too
everything
late.
starts to stall, right? Yeah. I do think that building a healthy so you've got to find that line where there's a healthy tension, so that you're not just letting everything through and then you might as well not be there at all, but
Hmm.
you're putting in enough challenge to make sure that things are right. And a lot of that comes from stakeholder engagement and management,
Yeah.
understanding what's driving those senior leaders in the business. But the other thing I do is try to be very, very transparent about what I'm doing as well. So having that conversation with a senior leader and saying, well, listen, this is the reason why I'm going to push back on these things, or this is the reason why we are going to have to build a framework for this.
Hmm.
Thinking about right now, I'm writing an AI framework for Alvotech. We need a framework for AI, because if we don't have that, it's going to get out of control very quickly. And let me explain why that is. And it's about contextualizing what you're doing and
Hmm.
being very transparent about it. And actually, what I found is with very senior leaders, if you're very honest and you're telling them what you're doing, they'll just go, oh, right, okay, that makes perfect sense. Then let's carry
Absolutely.
on the conversation with that in
Yeah.
mind. So I think there's a lot of talking to the stakeholders and understanding. There's obviously the you can look through what artifacts exist. I'm a big fan of having a strong kind of CMDB to base decisions off, understanding that estate. And that can be a massive task in itself, and one that is very easy to go down a rabbit hole. But making sure you've got some of those core references. But again, even that depends on what are people looking at in the company that you're working for.
And what's your personal measure of success of an architect, and how do you know when that architect or yourself is on the right track?
So I think the measurement I've used is when the business comes looking for you, when they want to invite you into one of their planning workshops, into a steerco meeting, into a strategy session, then you know that you're doing something right. And this is back to the kind of the reality of EA. It might, if we all sat down and said the things that I'm doing right, that a few of them probably aren't enterprise architecture. Some of it's IT advocacy, some of it's just general technological overview, but you can always get the EA piece in there. And I think some of the proudest moments for me have been when somebody in the business has said, "Oh, we're about to have a strategy workshop next week. I've got my whole team together. Can you just come and sit in with us and help guide us when we start talking about the IT bit?" That's absolutely fantastic, because it means you're that trusted partner. So yeah, I think the ability to guide and enable, not just dictate, to connect those dots across the team. So I think that's the other thing that we do a lot that's maybe underestimated a bit, is I find myself being the devil's advocate for the other departments an awful lot, because we're a very privileged position for enterprise architect, because you get to see the end-to-end business.
Yeah.
And so you can be sitting in with a team who think that their whole world is about the thing that they do. And you can say, did you know that there's actually a team over in this complete other function that do something very similar to this? Did you know they've got a system? Do you know that, you're interacting with this team over here indirectly, because when you put something in your system, they're getting a message over there. And particularly in a huge organization like AstraZeneca, we quite often found departments didn't even know they were working with other departments. They were working in these silos. So I think as soon as you start doing that, then it starts to become obvious to the business as well.
The value.
Yeah.
And for someone who's starting off as, maybe it's their first job in EA, or maybe they're in, the traditional route is SA to EA, whether that's right or wrong, I think that's a debate for a different day, but that's the traditional route. What for someone that's wanted to build their practical skills, where can they find genuinely useful real world EA guidance? And I'm going to caveat that with a lot of stuff that we see on LinkedIn from certain organizations, which are sort of PowerPoint, similar to TOGAF, we won't mention who they are, but high level theory, and it's not very practical. So yeah, where can someone find good content to build their practical EA skills?
So this is a really tricky question, because it is about experience.
Yeah.
So I think actually choosing the team that you join is really critical. I was lucky, I think, in AstraZeneca. The team I joined had some really experienced EAs in there, and they brought me up to speed really quickly, and kind of gave me some of these messages and concepts that really just resonated very well with me. So I think, joining an experienced EA team, or working close to an experienced EA team, listening, learning, interacting, asking questions, and a great EA team should welcome that curiosity as well, and bring those that kind of that desire in, I think. But I think there's a lot that people can do in terms of actually getting some really strong, often referred to as soft skills. I don't like that phrase, but these really critical skills in things like negotiation, in sales, in empathy, in having difficult conversations. These are all skills that are really, really useful. I was really lucky early on in my career to have to go and sell our service team's product. So I got involved in the sales cycle a lot, and I actually joined the sales team on a load of sales training. And it was really good to get that perspective of how to do that. So I think that's it. And I think then just kind of looking around, like you say, taking what you see on LinkedIn with a pinch of salt. There's an awful lot of theory on there. And it's one of the reasons why Hassan and I started our podcast, was to start to be able to have some real discussions about, hey, here's a real life example of when this happened and what we did. And you know what? And that might be completely counter to somebody who did it the other way. And both of them are still enterprise architecture. And I think your podcast is the same, you know, getting out there and listening to it. But it is really tricky, and it's very, you know, it's very hard to fast track experience.
Yeah. You mentioned something there which I think is really useful, and I think, you know, it ties into what I do on a day-to-day basis around two things, actually. Number one, picking the right team, and number two, picking the right company. What sort of assessment, I know you've gone from 15 years at AZ to, you know, to Alvotech, but, you know, what stuff have you looked at? And you've moved with different teams, so within that process you probably thought, right, okay, well, that team's that structure. What sort of triggers do you look for to make sure that you are getting that, you know, you are going to pick the right team and the right business to be able to be effective?
That's a great question. So one of the reasons why I made the jump to Alvotech from AstraZeneca was it was a startup when I joined. We're now producing products and getting them out there, and that's fantastic. And the CIO at the time had a great vision that she wanted EA at the heart and center of building out this startup into a you know, fully operational mid-sized enterprise. And so for me, that was the challenge, and actually the ability to use that experience in a new area. And since I've got involved in actually talking to other Icelandic companies about enterprise architecture, because enterprise architecture isn't a hugely broad skill in Iceland, so that's been quite interesting. But even that's difficult, and it comes back to maybe one of the first questions you asked around, you know, you need to look out for those people who get pulled in to the conversation, which is hard to do if you're doing it from outside. And I think that's where, you know, a good recruitment consultant can help with that, because you're going to know if they're a good EA team, you're going to know what's driving them, and you can give that advice to candidates. But I'd be looking for indications that the team is genuinely an EA team, that they're not just a delivery team, that they're focused on trying to join the dots from business strategy and so on. So I think it's very tricky, but I think that's how I'd start.
A couple of things, yeah. And how do you respond when someone challenges your approach with, you know, we've seen it, you know, time and time again, but that's not proper enterprise architecture?
I have to bite my tongue an awful lot, I'll be honest. I'd only really want to respond to anybody who said that if they've observed it in the context that I've been doing it, you know. I think that this is back to that point. I think without that context, it's very hard to understand the decisions you're going to make on a day-to-day basis. I make decisions right now that I would never have made in AstraZeneca, and in AstraZeneca, I made decisions that I would never make in Alvotech, because they're two such hugely different. Yeah, they're both pharmaceutical, but they're such hugely different environments. And while something might not look like proper EA, whatever that is, that will often be what's needed to build the trust, to gain exposure, and to move things forward. You know, there was this very interesting discussion that I had with somebody on LinkedIn probably about a year ago now, and somebody had put a framework up, and I said, well, I think it's missing strategy. It was about, you know, the capabilities of an enterprise architect, and I said, I think you're missing strategy off there. And there was a barrage of people saying EA shouldn't do strategy, that's a business function, the business should come to you with the strategy, and then you should, and of course, in a perfect world, that would be the way it would happen. The business would have a beautiful strategy that we could take and turn into an EA plan, and connect the dots back into the technology. But my point was, in my experience, very often an EA's job is to go in there and train the business about what a strategy even is, but certainly a departmental strategy, and help them at least articulate V1 of that strategy before they start digging into it. And I think if you just sit there and say, well, until you've done your strategy, I can't help you, then they're not going to ask you back, right? So this is the kind of the what I mean about the context. And I think actually if we stop debating what's proper and start sharing more real life experience,
Yeah.
people just start to work it out themselves. And they'll,
Yeah.
you can see there's a clear core of proper EA, and
Hmm.
everybody kind of knows what that is. And it seems we spend an awful lot of time fighting around the edges of that definition when
Yeah.
actually we could just be sharing experience.
Yeah. And with guests that we've had on this podcast, more often than not, the premise of the podcast was to ensure or to put a dent in that whatever the percentage is. I think BCG say it's 82% of digital transformations that fail. But we've had some really interesting guests here who have, EA sits in operations rather than in technology, and they get involved as you say, in V1 of the strategy, and those transformation programs have been successful
Yeah.
because, as you say, the beauty of EA is you're able to you understand the wider context of the whole business. And yes, are you going to sit there writing the strategy for someone in ops to sign off? No, you do it together. You say, well, actually, we've got this team over here that does that. We can't use that technology because of these reasons, and so on and so forth. And it just becomes a more holistic plan. And yeah, obviously that changes over time, of course, with technology in particular, it changes on a daily basis. But the overall strategic objective still remains the same.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and that's a point often debated as well, isn't it? Is where does EA sit? It's not proper EA unless it sits under the CEO. Well, then I expect there's not much proper EA going on at all, and we might as well all give up
Yeah,
if we're only going to drive it via proper EA. My view is, and again back to one of the first questions you asked, is if you're doing EA well, you're just making yourself available, you're getting in there, you're making a network, and it doesn't matter where it sits as long as
yeah,
you've got good connections into IT and you've
yeah.
got good connections into the business. And of course,
Hmm.
it helps if it's well enabled by the senior exec team.
Yeah,
But I think it can work even
without,
without that if
yeah.
you're making yourself useful, honestly.
And one of the challenges the industry or the discipline faces is the demographic.
Mm,
There's a saying around EAs from a diversity perspective, and we're going to touch on diversity. And I just want to be really clear that this isn't just ethnicity diversity or gender diversity or anything like that. It's all of the above, because diversity and inclusion is not just about one particular thing. There's a flywheel out there, pie chart, with so many different things. And I suppose you brought a really good point up when we had our initial discussion of the what you were doing at AZ, and why that brought diversity of thought into the team, and how critical that was for decisions being made. So why do you think diversity of thought is just as critical in architecture as diversity of background or demographic?
I think it's really important because the EA has to consider so many aspects. And actually, I don't think any one person can ever really make the right decision without talking to several other people
Hmm.
because it's just impossible. I've been in the business for nearly 30 years, and I still learn something new every single day,
Yep.
often from peers and the people who are working in the business and so on. And I think one of the things that I've always appreciated when I got into EA, one of the perspectives I could bring was that I had been in pretty much all the core roles in
Hmm.
an IT team. I'd
Yep.
done technical documentation, coding, testing, training, support, team leadership, management. I'd been there, done that. And actually, when I'm talking about how we put a solution in, or we're talking about how we create a platform to support the business, you can say, okay, but then we need to talk about also how are IT going to support this and how
Yep.
it, so I can bring that aspect. But what I can't bring is deep technical knowledge about how a pharmaceutical lab works, or the biopharmaceutical processes
Yep.
and things like that. And that's where you need other people. So by bringing this different people, and I've seen very successful EAs come in from the business who've got relatively light technical skills, and they do
Hmm.
just as well as somebody who's got deep technical skills.
Yep.
I think, at AstraZeneca, we had this apprentice scheme, and that really just blew my mind, was the impact that the two architects that we had on our team in terms of asking questions, of challenging the norms, and just being proactive about it. One guy just said, "Is it all right if I arrange?" I was chatting to another apprentice, and they work in the labs. They've said I can go and shadow them for a couple of weeks over summer. Is that all right if I go and do that? So absolutely go and do that. And they returned with the domain knowledge that very,
Yeah.
very few people in the team had, and they could
Yeah.
suddenly give us this insight. Well, you can't quite do that because actually when they're in the lab, they're all gowned up, or they're all,
Yeah.
suddenly you get these new perspectives. So I think that ability to bring in people who have these lots of different perspectives is absolutely crucial to making a real kind of solid world-class EA team.
And we were speaking to a chap called Ian Holloway, who at the time he was at EE, and they were speaking about a similar structure, not necessarily apprenticeship. There were grads, but they put them in different areas of technology, admittedly, to understand the different domains, so software engineering, cloud, etc. And then they would then become a more well-rounded solution architect. They would choose their discipline that they wanted to specialize in, do 6 months in that, and then become that T-shaped, or as he called it, the I-shaped architect. And I think organizations should really, really think about that deeply around the different areas that you get an architect from, whether that's projects BA, whether that's software, whether that's engineering in cloud or networks, and give them as much broad experience as possible early on, so they don't become too specialist. Because when you become too specialist, we go back to the problem we discussed right at the beginning of the podcast, which is you get into the detailing, start stepping on toes, and people start getting annoyed at you, and then all of a sudden you're not having the right conversations because you're not being invited to the table because they're worried about what might happen.
There's an interesting thing around that as well, which is people are, this sounds so obvious, people are different. And there are some people who have great comfort in staying in their lane, of taking on one technology, of being very aligned to that. And you've got to realize that you can't have everybody who's flitting around. And again, it comes back to diversity of thought. So you need some solid people who are going to just focus on one or two of the absolute core technologies, the biggest platforms or whatever in your solution architecture team. But then you do need people who relish the fact that, hey, can you quickly go in there, look at that system? I know you've never seen it before, but we need to, solve this problem. We've got a couple of weeks to do it. Just get on with it. And they absolutely love that. And you've got to work out then how you deploy those people in the right places, because you'll just cause chaos if you try and deploy the guy who wants to be focused on the one technology into go and solve this in 2 weeks. It's just going to freak them out. So that's a challenge as well in architectural leadership, I think, is managing that desire from people as well.
Of course it is. And then you got the wider sort of landscape, what's happening macro, not necessarily economically, but what's going on in the business world with, we saw it in 2016, 17, the rise of SaaS, and everybody wanted to be a SaaS business. And even Barclays as a bank called themselves a fintech business. And what that did was breed a load of software engineers at that time who now have kind of stepped into an architecture role. From my experience of speaking to a lot of these people, it's because they don't want to go into a leadership role, but they want to be close enough to making the technical leadership decisions. So they feel solution architecture is the way forward. Now, what risks do you see if that continues to happen for future architecture talent pipeline?
So I think you touched on that a bit there, which is, the mindset of a software engineer and the mindset of a solution architect and the mindset of an enterprise architect are not the same thing. So if you just take that as a steady stream of people through that, technical background, then developing that mindset is going to be quite difficult. If you think about it, just on the face of it, it makes perfect sense. Taking a software engineer and saying, hey, how are you going to link back what you're doing to the business strategy? They're not even going to realize potentially that there is a business strategy because there's so many layers disconnected from it. And no, that's a bit patronizing, but you know what I mean? So to get to that point where you realize IT wouldn't even be here if the business didn't need their processes supported by IT, and therefore everything we do is for IT. I've met a lot of solution architects who have thought it was their job to make sure the platform kept running or kept being used or kept being, and it's like, well, it's not. That's the business's job, is to make sure that happens. So I think there's a bit of that. I'll mention bias again. I think my own. The thing I have to keep in check every day is the fact that I have come from a technical background, and always in the back of my mind I go, oh, we could use this tech, and then it's like, okay, now take a step back. Now let's go and work out, is that actually the right thing that's gonna support the actual problem that the business have. And I think, it's really interesting seeing job adverts out there, and even talking to some recruiters, and it drives me nuts when I see on a job description, must understand, insert your tech list here. Nobody wants my knowledge of Oracle 8 disrupting anything. Yeah, I can talk about databases, I know how they're used, but that doesn't actually help an EA that much. This is back to staying in, not sweating the small stuff. So I think what I'm looking for in an EA, in a potential EA, if I'm recruiting, is somebody who wants to understand the business strategy and how that relates to IT. And I'm not saying you can't get there by coming up through the ranks, because that's what I did. So I'd be hypocritical to say it, but I think there's definitely a mindset that you need to look for. And I think some people just will never have that mindset. And for them, there need to be better pathways into and out of architecture that help them be exciting. We've seen in AstraZeneca, we moved a few people from architects into platform leads, where we saw that they really wanted to stay technical and be there. So they moved there. We've seen people come into architecture from both the business and from business analysis. But I think helping to formalize some of those things would make it a bit clear too.
And with that, we have, going back to the diversity of thought piece, I think, again, theoretically versus practicality, right? It sounds amazing. We've got a highly diverse team from different backgrounds, etc., etc. It's amazing. But I suppose it'd be good for people to understand, especially if people are starting off in their leadership journey, where you've seen that diversity of thought directly improve an architectural outcome, because then people have an example of why they're trying to create a diverse team.
Yeah, so there's a couple of examples I think here. So as the sole architect in Alvotech, I often and actively seek out input from both the business and the IT teams. I regularly engage with people who aren't architects and who wouldn't consider themselves architecture savvy, who I know are, who will pick me up when I'm saying, should we just do this? No, you need to think a bit harder about that, And I often thank colleagues for helping me reach a conclusion that I don't think I'd have found alone. People aren't afraid to challenge me. I think that's a sign of a good leader, and I'm not afraid to change my opinion either. So I think I see that kind of on a day-to-day basis. There was one thing that always stood out to me, is back to the apprentices at AstraZeneca. So this guy came in as an apprentice, solution architect apprentice, and I had my leadership team together in Manchester, and I invited him along for a day just to sit in on the meeting, see how things work at that top level. We were starting doing our planning, and I thought it would be interesting for him to get some experience and see that and hear it. And I was talking to the team, and we were talking about how we could be better at responding to requests coming from the business. And I said, well, and this is quite embarrassing to admit in retrospect, I was saying, well, we so rarely get proper business requirements before blueprinting, so we're going to have to think about how we deal with that. And the apprentice just said, well, why do you put up with that? Why shouldn't you be asking for user requirements? Isn't that fundamental? Isn't that something that should just happen? How can you design systems without user requirements? And I was like, Oh damn, yeah, he's right. And so we actually then that took the conversation in a completely different place. Right, how are we going to implement it so that we can drive better requirements into the team, where we can get involved earlier so we can be making sure that they're good quality, and then that's going to lead us to a better quality of delivery. So I think, just calling out that really obvious thing that 5, 6 really experienced leaders were sitting in a room and we had all just kind of gone with it.
Mm,
It just always comes back to me. This is the reason why we need apprentices coming through our
yeah.
team, is just for them to say, "You're talking nonsense."
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a fantastic example. Now, it wouldn't be a architecture podcast if we didn't mention AI.
Of course.
And we're probably at the stage now where AI is calming down somewhat. We've got over the hype, and now businesses are starting to really get under the skin of it. But it's still somewhat chaotic. And I think architecture are very much in the trenches with that. So I want to talk about sort of AI ready architecture without the chaos. So
Yeah.
obviously the EU AI Act deadline is fast approaching. What sort of governance, sorry, or elements should be in every reference architecture, in your opinion?
I think the assessment, this assessment that's coming as part of the act is going to be critical. And it comes back to what I was saying before about having a really good CMDB, excuse me, really good CMDB or EA tool, the ability to just know what you've got in your estate. And that's easy for me to say in my current role because we don't have that much, and we can fairly easy catalog it, and we're moving on with that. But as always with these things, the process of keeping that data current, of reviewing it, of making sure that you're not missing things, that's going to be really critical, because that's going to help you take then a risk-based approach to,
Mhm.
okay, these are the big ones, these are the ones we're going to have to watch. For a company that's been using AI for years and years, AstraZeneca, again, great example. They were doing AI, deep machine learning back in, well, early 90s, I would say. Sorry,
Uh,
early 2000s. And they are they're going to have a real, excuse me, they're going to have a real challenge on their hands, because that cataloging alone is going to be a massive task for
Yeah.
them. But I do think getting on top of that is going to be able to, as a lot of things in the pharma world, and I think it's a good lesson for EA as well, is taking a risk-based approach. So we might have 500 things, but let's focus on the top 100 at least to
Mhm.
start with. And I
Yeah.
think just understanding where those high risk things are is going to be really critical. And again, just understanding that context and the future implications in terms of potentially advanced companies who have a good TRISM framework can potentially build some of this into that as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, I think.
Okay. Where do you see AI genuinely accelerating the architect's job, and where will it never replace the human?
So it's funny. This question's been floating around on LinkedIn a little bit as well recently, and I I don't think architecture is any different to any other job. So I think it's going to support in terms of helping to prepare and structure information, help to
Hmm.
filter and process big data sets,
Yeah.
help as a starting point for artifacts and documentation. But but an EA and I so let me do that again. An AI tool is never going to have that full context. It can't go out and have the water cooler conversations. It can't understand the
Okay.
politics that are going on. So you're never going to be able to walk up to an AI and say, generate me the target state architecture. You can say what might be the future target state of some of these applications, and it can give you some ideas.
Hmm.
Again, real world example. This week, we're currently going through Sarbanes-Oxley audit,
Yeah.
and I asked AI to break down the regulations into requirements and controls, to format that data so I could import it into our EA tool, and then map the applications against those controls, so we could have a bit of an overview from the EA tool. And it did in 5 minutes what it would have taken me a day or two to do
Hmm.
trawling through websites. So I think use it to help, use it to guide. It's going to plug into more and more repositories. It's going to be able to make some suggestions, but I think you've always got to treat it as a baseline. First draft.
Yeah, and balance it. Balance the speed of that artifact generation with context, review, compliance, and so on and so forth. That's integral.
100%. And one of the things that used to drive me nuts when I used to run an ARB was getting blueprints that obviously people had just copied and pasted from the one before.
Yeah.
Yeah. And AI is a little bit like that. It's like people wouldn't stop copy pasting. I always used to say, please start from scratch. If you can't think of it in the moment, it's probably not worth putting in anyway. Loads and loads of boilerplate text is not helpful.
Yeah.
But they would still copy paste because it was faster. In the future, people are just going to say to an AI, help me generate this. But we're going to be able to spot what's AI generated, just like we could spot what was copy pasted. And I think that's just going to be another way of generating a first draft and getting to the result. The danger is when somebody rocks up and says, this is the final answer, and they haven't done the review and they haven't done that due diligence. But to be honest, I've seen blueprints where it felt like they'd just done that from a previous system copy paste anyway. So, in reality, the risk is not hugely more than copy paste is today, honestly.
Okay. Perfect. Well, we're going to move on to our quickfire questions. So, what advice would you give to a newly appointed chief architect?
Talk to the exec team, understand their priorities, and get a feeling of which of them will be your advocates and which will not, and then get even closer to the ones who won't be.
Fair enough. And any advice you wish you'd received early on in your career, John?
So I actually posted the other day on LinkedIn following listening to your podcast about this because I was dreading having this question asked. But I think you just have to realize that there's always bumps in the road, but actually over 20, 30 years of experience, building those long-term relationships. I've made a lot of friends through my career, and that gives me the feeling that there's something tangible there. So, don't worry about those bumps in the road. There's always hard times. It's always difficult, but, just get on. Don't worry about it. And actually, looking back, I feel like I've had a wonderful career.
Brilliant. Now, you've been an interim CIO, albeit for not very long, and most of your career you've reported into a CIO or a CTO.
Yeah.
What do you think they actually care about?
So my initial thing would be, it depends on the CIO. But actually, one thing that I can say from working with quite a few, as you say, is that there's definitely a thread that runs through all of them. And that is that all CIOs just want to deliver the best IT experience in the context of the company that they're working for. Okay. And that starts from the minute you open your laptop and the quality of the Wi-Fi. So IT isn't, this took me a long time to realize. And we had a CIO come into AstraZeneca, and his first thing we've got to do, we've got to have laptops at work. When you open them, you've got to have strong Wi-Fi. And I was like, why are you focusing on that? We've got these massive systems that have got problems and needs upgrades. But actually he was right, because that gave IT the credibility. Suddenly everybody was like, I can just go anywhere. I can open my laptop and immediately connect to the Wi-Fi. Now I'm happy to have a conversation with IT. And I think I see that as a thread through pretty much every CIO I've worked with.
Fair enough. If you could ask one question to a CIO and get an honest answer, no corporate politics or anything like that, what would that question be?
So that question, I think, would be, after providing the best IT for the company, what's your biggest driver in doing that? And the reason I'd ask that question is because that helps me contextualize the EA that I'm providing. The CIO is one of the big stakeholders in EA, and you want them to be behind you. So I want to know that in the goal of delivering the best IT, what is it that drives them? And I'd want them to be very, very honest about, it could be to have the best platforms. It could be to keep the lights on and never have anybody tell us that IT is terrible. I don't mind, because that just helps me tailor the way that I'm providing EA to that person.
Okay, brilliant. Well, sadly, John, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for an excellent podcast episode. It's been really interesting and great chatting to you about why EA needs a reality check. So yeah, once again, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for inviting me. It's been great. Cheers, Mario.
And that's a wrap on another episode of Transformational Blueprints. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you found plenty of insights and takeaways to fuel your journey. If you enjoyed the episode, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could share it, leave a review, or give us a like. It helps us reach more people in the industry who can benefit from these conversations. Don't forget to follow Synaxia Group on LinkedIn to stay updated on new episodes. The links are in the show notes. Join us next time for more tips, strategies, and stories from some of the brightest minds in technology and transformation. Until then, take care and keep transforming.